Welcome to episode 57 of Detour 365. We're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 3. Now we're trying to stick in rough chronological order here. So we were in Judges last week, and we are now in 1 Samuel. We're looking at the encounters people are having with God in the Old Testament, in particular the theophanies, and the times when God appears either to have come in human form or appear to at least have some sort of human-like emotion. And if you have any questions, check out the rest of this series. We have a lot of examples of this. And in this case, God is calling Samuel. Now we're past the time of we're kind of in between the time of the judges and the time of the kings. You have the prophet Samuel that comes onto the scene, and in this story, he's a adolescent. We're not really given his age, I don't think, in the story, but he is an apprentice priest, I guess you could say, and he hears the voice of God, and actually 4 times, and it also describes God as standing and calling, which to me sort of means some sort of form or appearance. And again, it's an audible voice, so that's also another reason why we are looking at this passage here. And so, Bill is reading 1 Samuel 3. You're going to be reading the CJV version.
Yep.
And
we'll be attempting to pronounce the words in the CJV.
Pronounce the word.
The child Shmuel, S-H''MU''EL.
I didn't mean to interrupt. That took me
And
off.
that's about the best I can pronounce his name.
Not Shmuel.
Not Shmuel.
Okay, Shmuel.
Shmuel continued ministering to Adonai under Eli's direction. Now in those days, Adonai rarely spoke, and visions were few. Once during that period, Eli had gone to bed. His eyes had begun to grow dim, so that it was hard for him to see. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Shmuel had lain down to sleep in the sanctuary of Adonai, where the ark of God was. Adonai called, "Shmuel," and he answered, "Here I am." Then he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me?" But he said, "I didn't call you. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Adonai called a second time, "Shmuel." Shmuel got up, went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me?" He answered, "I didn't call, my son. Lie down again." Now Shmuel didn't yet know Adonai. The word of Adonai had not yet been revealed to him. Adonai called, "Shmuel," again, a third time. He got up, went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me?" At last, Eli realized it was Adonai calling the child. So Eli said to Shmuel, "Go, lie down. If you are called again, say, 'Speak, Adonai, your servant is listening.'" Shmuel went and lay down in his place. Adonai came and stood then spoke as at the other times, Shmuel, Shmuel. Then Shmuel said, Speak, your servant is listening. Adonai said to Shmuel, Look, I am going to do something in Israel that will make both ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. On that day I will do against Eli everything I have said with regard to his family, from beginning to end. For I have told him that I will execute judgment against his family forever, because of his wickedness in not rebuking his sons, even though he knew that they had brought a curse on themselves. Therefore, I have sworn to the family of Eli that the wickedness of Eli's family will never be atoned for by any sacrifice or offering. Shmuel lay there until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of Adonai. But Shmuel was afraid to tell Eli the vision. Then Eli called Shmuel. Shmuel, my son? He answered, Here I am. Eli said, What did he say to you? Please don't hide it from me. May God do whatever he said, and worse, if you hide from me anything he said to you. So Shmuel told him every word and hid nothing. Eli replied, It is Adonai. Let him do what seems good to him. Shmuel kept growing. Adonai was with him, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. All Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, became aware that Shmuel had been confirmed as a prophet of Adonai. Adonai continued appearing in Shiloh, for Adonai revealed himself to Shmuel in Shiloh by the word of Adonai.
Very good.
Thank you.
Wow. That's some water there. All right. Well, there's a lot to talk about here.
Yes, indeed.
A lot. So, I guess let's begin with that whole phrase, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Because I believe it mentions that twice.
Yes.
In this, and it kind of reminds me of the repetition that's in the book of Judges, where it says in the book of Judges, it says over and over again, there was no king in Israel. Everybody did what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing that, but it's, it's interesting that it mentions that, and also the curious detail about the lamp of God not going out. It's also, I think there's some symbolism baked into that, you know. But I have wondered, I'm hearing thunder outside, is the frequency of God's presence, or at least our perception, because God is always there, just like in the story and in the book of Judges and Samuel and throughout all time, God is always there. But our perception of God's presence, and also the way God appears to us, it seems like, Well, I've often wondered, is that an indication of, and I don't think this is a yes or no answer, but I don't think, well, I think it's mostly yes, but in this case, the peoples of Israel's relationship with God, that was kind of a dark time because Eli's leadership was not good, and it doesn't really tell us why the word of the Lord was rare, but it kind of implies that his sons were mucking things up, and we'll go into a little more detail about his sons here in a little bit, but
well, Saul had also rejected God's information and God's blessings and things. He just rejected him. So that added to Eli's sons were, I had a phrase that I had read, they were hoarding the blessings that were supposed to be among everybody. And I had never thought about it that way. They were keeping them all for themselves.
Yeah.
And they weren't caring for the people, they were caring for themselves.
Well, that's true. I mean, I picked the worst time to eat it.
I'm sorry.
She waited until you.
I did.
Well, you think,
if we look at our life, like our relationship with God and the level to which we experience God's presence and work in our life, and God speaking to us through various ways. Now there are times that I say it's not 100% a yes answer, because there are times that I do believe we have those. Charles Stanley, pulling a name out of a hat, had the sermon about like valley experiences, and so everybody goes through. Well, the disciples went through. I'm thinking of the disciples when they went out onto the lake without Jesus, and they were in the storm and in the boat. That really wasn't. They weren't doing anything wrong. But they were kind of being, I guess, tested or something. So we do have storms and times of testing that we don't bring upon ourselves, but at the same time, we are called to pray and respond and seek God's presence, and it seems like the more we do that, the more we experience God's presence. But you have something to say.
the entirety of life, I believe, is a test.
Yeah, yeah.
From the time we awaken in the morning until the time we go to bed at night. The questions that we are given to address are more profound as we go through the day or the years, but in some form or another, God is watching us and seeing how we live our response to our lives with Him. He's always with us. Although sometimes He's certainly more immediately present with us than at others. Like we see here with Samuel. Samuel hadn't ever really had an experience with God before. Like we've said, we believe he is an adolescent, probably a young adolescent. time of him becoming a man.
Now, this phrase does come up, I think, at the beginning of the New Testament with Zechariah, right? It says something about the Lord, the word of the Lord was rare. Because you have that time between, the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. That's what, roughly 300 years, something like 400 years.
Yeah, 400 years.
That also, during that time, the word of the Lord was rare.
Yes, Israel just hadn't heard anything from God in 400 years.
So
They didn't recognize it if they heard it.
That's right.
yeah, so that's kind of the other thing. I'm just wondering if, well, God is always speaking to us, but is there something to there's some instances where our perception of God speaking to us and receiving words from God gets affected by our, I don't want to say performance, but our faithfulness and seeking and following the path. And then there are times when, like Job or like others, where you go through these periods where you're kind of left scratching your head.
Well, I don't think God's speaking to us all the time. He's with us all of the time. But being present with us all the time is considerably different than interacting with us. But here we have one of actually the more significant beginnings of interactions of God with his people. We have seen the end of the judges, which was a strange period where God took significantly imperfect people, people that many would have never suspected would have become leaders, and made them into leaders simply by the power of God. And that period ends, and that was a period of kind of craziness, because God changed these people and enabled these people to lead the nation, and we would have a period of a generation of strength and peacefulness, and that would subside as soon as that judge would pass away, and the people would go right back to what they were doing. And we saw that cycle repeat itself a number of times. And with Samuel, we see the breaking of that cycle.
Now, when it says the word of the Lord was rare, it wasn't necessarily rare in the time of the judges, would you say? Or, I mean, it would kind of, God would call a judge, and
yes,
the judge would do stuff.
Right.
And some judges were better than others, relatively speaking. They were all flawed individuals, but, I just wonder why it specifies here that it's like it rare. What is rare? and what,
I think,
and why, is it, do you think it's because of Eli's sons, or do you think it's,
well, we're
Saul.
looking,
And Saul.
no, Saul's not really here
oh,
yet.
Saul does come on the scene
Yeah,
later,
but-
but
Yeah, he's not here yet.
there's probably a little Saul running around somewhere.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but he's not really in the mix yet.
he was a tall kid.
But we know that Eli has had interactions with God,
Yeah.
and we know that Eli has not disciplined his sons in their interactions with the people and taking care of Adonai's house. I mean, this is still when the Ark of the Covenant is in the house of God in Shiloh.
Yeah.
And Eli's sons are just taking the offerings and using them for themselves.
Now this is during the tabernacle period, right?
Yes.
So
So this is still the tent.
this is the tent that's up on kind of the top of a mountain, high place kind of thing. Shiloh's kind of up there,
Right. But it's still in Shiloh, it's still in a
Yeah.
tent. But people are still bringing offerings, and Eli's sons are using these offerings to their advantage and not doing all the stuff they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be, helping take care of the widows and the orphans and taking care of the spiritual needs of the community. And they aren't doing that. They're carousing and not being godly men. They aren't leading the nation of Israel in how is right to live as Adonai has described is proper to live.
Now it is interesting that it's in chapter 2 verse 1 that just kind of describes them. Chapter 2 verse 12, I should say. Now Eli's sons were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. Then it goes on to say that Eli did rebuke his sons, or it said, but he didn't really. He just kind of said, why do you do such things? Eli does kind of tell them to stop doing what they're doing, but I guess that's not forceful enough. Yeah. Because I guess under the law of Moses, they should have been.
They should have been
killed.
kicked out of the tabernacle.
Yeah, or at least kicked out.
At the very least, been kicked out. None of their actions should have been permitted. Now, I don't know whether it would have been appropriate for them to have been killed or not, but they should have at least been kicked out of the priesthood and perhaps exiled. I mean, what they were doing was really wrong.
Yeah, they did a bunch of things, right?
And their behavior as Eli's sons was really leading the nation badly. Eli knew it, and Eli knew God knew it. and yet Eli could not bring himself to discipline his sons.
Now, I might be jumping ahead a little bit because I was going to go to the Samuel's response to God's calling and the whole interaction, but I did want to ask what you think of God speaking to Eli through Samuel about Eli's sons. You know, God doesn't wake Eli up and tell him. You know, God sends Samuel, who's much younger, to.
Well,
It's. I mean, and it might be a little bit different than sending an older prophet. You know, is that kind of a humbling thing, or is that like
the nation didn't really have prophets yet.
Yeah.
It's with Samuel that we really see the establishment of prophets in the nation. And it's important that we remember that Eli has heard the voice of Adonai. And here we have this adolescent, just turned a man, I would presume, who's been given to God by his mother and father, and he has this experience. He's been growing up there in the tabernacle, being raised by Eli, and here he is in the middle of the night. He hears his name called. Now he responds because he thinks it's Eli. I can only presume that it's probably just he and Eli there in the tabernacle.
So the setup here, though, because I know this isn't in the temple, but for some reason whenever I heard this story, I would envision, you know, because it said Samuel was sleeping there, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, not curled up next to the Ark of the Covenant, but, you know, like nearby. Was Eli, because the tent's not that, I mean, this was a big tent, but, I mean, I don't see Eli wasn't sleeping in the tent. He was sleeping kind of off in another tent, I would presume.
I don't know where Eli would have been sleeping. Not too far away.
But Eli didn't hear the voice. Yeah, Samuel.
I don't think Eli would have heard the voice had he been lying right next to Samuel.
Okay.
Are
you saying he's old? Well, I have heard that when God's people hear God speak in an audible voice, that sometimes other people don't hear it.
Oh, they hear it as
Thunder,
something
like
tonight.
Yeah.
He's been speaking to us, and
speaking to somebody,
and we can't understand it. But I think we have to presume that Samuel was sleeping in the sanctuary. And made me think that Eli, if not in the sanctuary, was still very close.
Are you allowed to just sleep in there? That's another thing I was wondering. Is he kind of maintaining the lamp or something, and kind of?
Well,
Was that lamp supposed to burn all the time or something, or was that?
I would think that there would be a lamp that would be supposed to burn there all the time, but we are given nothing.
Yeah.
To have, given nothing to establish a context for any of that.
Well, it does mention that it was at night, and
everyone should be in bed.
Yeah. So the whole thing about it being sort of I guess kind of the subtext of that being that it's like a dark, it's a dark time and God's not speaking much, and Eli's sons are.
It was a dark and stormy night.
It was a dark and stormy night. Literally, and but it says, the lamp of God was still going, and then it mentions that little detail about Samuel being there, asleep somewhere in the tent.
It's important for us to know that Samuel's in the sanctuary. Why he's in the sanctuary, we don't know. Apparently it's not a problem for him to have been there. But he's taken to sleeping there. But he's never heard anything before. But tonight he does, and he hears it, and he is close enough that he would normally hear Eli if Eli would call for him. So he hears his name, and he gets up and he goes to Eli, wherever Eli is. And he responds, and Eli tells him that, I didn't call you. Go on back to bed.
Now, what do you make of God's persistence in this? Because God calls him actually 4 times.
Well, God is consistent in his call to us. God doesn't give up on us unless we're just certainly like Eli's sons.
Now, is there a difference between, in the case of Samuel here, he's missing, he doesn't know that it's God speaking to him. Just like with us, there could be instances where we don't know if this is God speaking to us, but it is God speaking to us. Then there are those other instances where God is speaking to us and we know it, or have a strong sense that.
That's one of the reasons.
And then we kind of close our ears, But
that's one of the reasons why it is important for us to ask for the ability to understand when God is talking to us, and the ability to understand what he is saying. Samuel was ignorant, and sadly I would venture to say most of us are ignorant.
At least more ignorant than we should be.
So, yes. Do we hear God calling? I think
Well, yeah, you mentioned earlier, I mean, God isn't constantly sending us messages.
Right.
You know, but there are probably a lot of messages that God sends that we don't get,
And
that we could have gotten.
had we been paying attention and praying to understand, praying for understanding what he is saying. And you mentioned something a moment ago that is important, sad, but important. How many of the things that God has been saying to us over time have we heard but didn't want to respond to?
Well, I guess like Eli.
God, like Eli, God, I don't want to discipline my sons. I don't want to take my sons out in the streets and flog them for the way they're stealing from the tabernacle.
And why do you think Eli, this might be a little bit off course, but why do you think Eli didn't want to do that? Was it just a pride thing, or was, because I've heard different theories. I've heard the theory too that Eli was also kind of benefiting from, you know, because it talks about later on in other might be the next chapter when the ark is stolen by the Philistines and Eli hears about it and he falls backwards, and it mentions like that Eli was fat, you know, and it kind of goes out of its way to say Eli was fat and he was very heavy, and you know, it kind of insinuates that he was stealing the food from the altar, living off the living high on the hog, or
he was an old priest. He ate too much, granted, but stealing, yeah. He was an old priest who didn't move around a whole lot.
Yeah.
Was he stealing? That's hard to say. You know, all the people were giving offerings to God. Was he taking more than he should have? I don't know that any of us are. At least I don't remember anything that definitively says Eli was taking more than he should. But we do know that he's old and fat, and he's not leading the people well in the ways of God.
Yeah, at the end of chapter 4, it definitely goes out of its way to say that for the man was old and heavy, you know, so. But I seem to recall a sermon preached on this where but I guess there's more evidence for his sons. You know, he had some sort of thing about not disciplining his sons.
Well, we're told outright that his sons were a problem. And then God takes care of disciplining Eli's sons.
Well, but you know, it doesn't seem like God speaks to his sons at all.
No, God kills them.
Yeah, just kidding. But it's also kind of makes you wonder, Samuel's growing up all this time, Eli's sons are growing up all this time. You know, the state of things, it's not like one day things were kind of were like this, you know. It's not that one day Eli's sons were adults and, you know.
Well, Eli's sons were adults while Samuel you know, here in chapter 3, Samuel is just hearing God for the first time, and Eli's sons are adults and performing duties, priestly duties. I mean, they're already adults
But
and
I guess
doing work.
This took time, for that. There was a lot of opportunity for Eli to do something about this, but he didn't.
Yes. Eli had a chance, and he did not respond. How many of us are given chances and we don't respond? And that's something that is worrisome.
But kind of coming back to responding, you have these instances where Samuel doesn't know, and he's going to Eli. It does seem like God shows some leniency towards, and I think this is even something that Jesus said, and I might be reading too much into this scripture, so keep that in mind. But I can't, it's on the tip of my tongue, but it's something to the effect of, if you are, there are different variations of it, but if you are someone who knows what they should do, as far as God, your relationship with God and how you should live, and you don't do it, versus if you're somebody that is less informed, but you kind of, and that was probably something that Paul wrote as well. I think Paul mentioned something like this about Gentiles and, them not having the law, and but I know if you're a teacher, it says you're going to be judged more harshly.
Yeah.
And if if you're given more information and more, God does expect you to do something with that. And I don't want to sound legalistic. I'm not trying to sound legalistic. It's more like there's a certain, it seems like God understands if you're somebody who's like a newer person to the faith or a newer
Yes.
Christian, and you don't quite,
you're
not that discerning, versus, like Paul saying, you should be eating meat now, but you're drinking milk, or something. It's like kind
of. I believe that. I fear there is perhaps a point in time when, and it fits right in with our theme, when God gets fed up. He's had it. The line's drawn. You cross the line. You've done it too many times. On one hand, I kind of feel that way, but then we have Jesus saying, how many times do you forgive your brother?
Right.
Yeah, but that hinges on sincere repentance. You really desire to change, and that sincerity is important. Here we have Samuel, he's ignorant.
Well,
So-
it's just because he's younger and he hasn't
Well,
experienced.
he's just ignorant.
Yeah.
But so God calls Samuel 3 times, and finally, at the 3rd time, Eli realizes what's happening because Eli has spoken with God before. And he tells Samuel, he realizes what's going on. And he tells Samuel, Samuel, if you're called again, you respond and
But in that case, if Samuel had heard, and you know I'm big on hypotheticals, but if Samuel had heard God that time and he knew it was God, and he just said, "Oh, well, I'm sure you'll get back to me later. I'm just going to go back to sleep,"
we would not have the book
Yeah.
of 1 Samuel.
We would not, that's why I think, God would deal with that situation a little bit.
There would have never been a 1 Samuel. There would have been a 1 George or something, because
The
someone
1 George.
else would have taken Samuel's place.
So there is kind of a responsibility we have. I'm not saying we should desire to be ignorant, so that we can get off easier, but, if we, because we have the Bible in many translations that we can look at, and we have all these resources and things, and, that's a blessing, but I often wonder, I mean, if you look at the early Christians, or, the early Christians, especially before the Council of Nicaea, they might have had one scroll or something, that might have been part of the book of Mark or something like that. They didn't have a lot really to go on, but is more expected of us?
Yes. Without a doubt.
Yeah.
We are blessed. We are blessed with so many tools. I know I should be currently engaged somehow more than I am. I'm trying to think of how many hard copies of the Bible I have at home in different translations and different studies, different text studying books of the Bible, and how many writings of people over time, and sermon series, and yada yada.
Now, would you say God also takes into account the fact that we have a lot of distractions at the same time? We have a lot of things that are, I'm not saying this is an excuse or anything like that, but you could also say that we have access to a lot, but also it's not necessarily that we can't access translations of the Bible or different resources, but, there's a lot distracting us.
No.
Yeah.
I don't think God cuts us any slack for that at all. They are just what you stated, distractions.
Right.
And I think He expects us to
But it's a lot easier to
not
read your
be
Bible
distracted.
if you're in a cabin in the woods and you just have a Bible.
Oh, absolutely.
versus you're at your house and you have all this other stuff, you know.
Oh, you're absolutely right. It is a lot easier to do that. There's a whole lot more happening if you're at home, and if you're working. I'm retired, and how much time do I have to sit and read? Should I be reading scripture versus watching a movie with my wife? I should.
Well,
No, I should probably be reading.
Yeah. I mean, or prayer, in prayer, and
should I be? How much of my time should I be devoting to that? I do struggle with that. I don't have a good answer for that at this point in my life.
well, I mean, I know we are forgiven for, but I guess, there is the whole, are we living up to 20% of our potential, from God's perspective, or 60%, or, I mean, you're not going to be thrown into, Jesus paid for your sins, so you're not going to be thrown into hell because you don't read your Bible, but as much as you should. But
well, what are we accomplishing?
Yeah.
Look at Samuel. Here we,
yeah,
turn back to the lesson.
Yeah,
Samuel's called 3 times, doesn't have a clue.
right.
Thinks it's Eli. Eli finally tells him, "Hey, it's not me, it's God." So, when the 4th time Eli is called,
Samuel's called.
Adonai, Samuel gets up and says, finally, Adonai came and stood.
Well, yeah, do you see that as a God coming in physical form, again, because it kind of fits in this
I
story
think,
or some sort of form that he's
I think
there,
God took form and was present with Samuel. Yes. Because Samuel needed that.
Yeah.
I think God gives us what we need. And Samuel needed that.
Yeah.
And then God told Samuel what was going to happen. I'm going to do something in Israel that will make both ears of everyone who hears about it tingle. How does another translation have that?
What verse is it?
That is 11.
The 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. Is there something in that expression that?
This one says, I'm getting ready to do something in Israel that is going to shake everyone up and get their attention.
Oh.
Is that the message?
Mm-hmm.
I think that is important, and if we really went to church and had good preachers and were listening today, we would be hearing messages like that. We would be hearing messages that would shake us up. That would be making our ears tingle.
And this was coming from a time when the voice of the Lord was rare.
Yes.
So it's almost like the voice of the Lord was rare because of kind of this mass spiritual malaise, yeah. And it's God's kind of shaking them out of it. And it's interesting how God does it, not just installing Samuel, but Samuel's installed after the ark is taken, Eli's sons die in battle, and then Eli falls out of a chair.
That's
and
right.
Dies.
You know, it's people are distracted.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we have.
Was this a relatively peaceful time after the judges? I mean, they didn't seem to have
Relatively. I mean, it's, the times are the same.
Yeah.
People are the same. You know, we have technology today. Whoopie-doo. I mean, people are not any different now than we were. Let's see, this is some
1500 BC?
3,500 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, 1500, yeah. BC.
So, people are the same dating back, period. You know, we're distracted. You know, we're paying attention when we're acquiring food that we need to eat because we're hungry. You know, there are some things we get focused on, and we should be focused on our relationship with the people we love, our relationship with God. Actually, it should be focused on our relationship with God and the people we love. Those are the most important things. And how many of us actually focus on those things? Samuel, at that time, had this direct experience with God. And I think more people would have direct experiences with God of some sort or another. But people have to want it and have to try, have to be open to the experience of God. You know, you couldn't just say, well, I'm going to believe in God. Hey, I'm going to pray tonight. I need an experience with God tonight, or I'm not going to, I'm not going to believe all this God stuff.
Well, it does seem like even when we do have experiences, or whether it's a word we come across, or God literally speaking to us, or some kind of synchronicity or thing, or prayer answered in a way that's not really that explainable. I mean, it does help to write it down, but I've found that it does kind of tend to fade fairly quickly. I mean, from your memory. I mean, if you really think about it, but if you're, as you're like going through your day and your consciousness, You know, we should all have a lot of faith, you know, if we really look at all the things God's done for us, but you know, how to keep that in the front of your mind other than pray that it stays in the front of your mind, you know. That
one thing that I have found of interest in the complete Jewish Bible versus other translations, one reason I'm enjoying it at this point is instead of talking about faith, it talks about trust. It's words that other translations consistently translate as faith, it translates as trust. We are trusting. Instead of having faith in, it says we have trust in. Do we trust God? A slightly different
yeah.
but I think that's a valid viewpoint. Do we trust God? You know, if we talk about having faith, church people can talk a lot about faith. And when you're talking to people who aren't in the church, you start talking a lot about faith and they think, oh, you're just a churchy person.
Well, trust kind of implies more of you're trusting God's, both his ability and his character. Or your faith, it's more like, at least when I hear those words, when I hear faith, I think of people having faith that Jesus can heal the paralytic, believing that Jesus can heal him, versus trust. You know, trust is almost like, you know, when you're doing that trust exercise and you're falling backwards, you know the person can hold you, but you're trusting that they are going to do that.
You're trusting that they are.
Yeah. Which is little different. You know, it's like the disciples. Well, I think the disciples kind of struggled with both. I mean, as we all do, but you know, I guess using the example of them being out on the boat, being swamped, you know, they had to trust that, you know, Jesus didn't leave them, you know, out in the middle of the lake to drown, you know.
But it's, you know, it's one thing I think that, you know, our listeners need to ponder. You know, do we trust God? To what extent do we desire to have an experience with God?
Well, trust is more relational too, right? I mean,
yeah. Do I, you know, I think trust is in many ways more difficult to relate to in the society today, because particularly, you know, millennials were drifting, but Gen Z and X are, you know, their relationships are, you know, techie bound. to a great extent. Their personal interactions had become more wrapped in technical trappings.
But do you also see at the same time there's at least especially after 2020 and all that, there's, I don't know, I see two trends. I see that whole trend of, what was that book, Bowling Alone, and not, the loss of community and connection. And I don't know if Bowling Alone's a Christian book. I don't think it is, but it was just about cultural trends, But I do see that people do have this ingrained, made in God's image need for connection and. So it does seem like there's a little bit of a recognition recently, and I'm speaking sort of broadly, but that we've gone too far off course, so there's a little bit of, we need to, especially with AI coming on the scene, what makes us human versus, the whole need for relationships, and it almost seems like there is some, and it varies from individual to individual, and their desire to course correct in this, but it does seem like there's a little bit of a revival of at least the acknowledgement that
society had,
because they didn't have to really grapple with this like 100 years ago as much, because it was kind of built into the.
You looked at going into the 20th century, relationships had. Society in general had been pretty much the same for the previous 10,000 years, I think, 15,000 years. You had a structure which was based by, on the fact that the male would go out and provide for the family and protect the family, and women would raise and basically educate the children, and take care of home and maintain communications within the community, because men didn't really do that.
I would almost say that if you took those people, and we're nearing a break, but if we took those people from 100 years ago and plopped them into today's world, they'd be exactly like the people today. They would eventually become
Oh, you see, I don't think so. I think if you took someone from 100 years ago and plopped them into today, I think they would be scared to death and lost.
Well, I guess if you took a baby from 100 years ago and put it in today,
Oh, yeah.
There's nothing genetically different about it.
Nothing genetically different, but if you took an individual from...
Just like it was easier to go to church 50 years ago, because there wasn't as much else to do, and you were kind of well, maybe if you go back 100 years, you were kind of half expected to be there, and it was kind of
And it was also a hub of social life. That's where you met.
Social was.
It's where you met people. That's
you
where.
didn't live 500 miles from your next of kin either. You all lived in the same community, so you didn't. That was sometimes that was all there was to do.
Yeah.
To go to church. So.
So I guess my only thing I'm contending, and I promise we're gonna break in 30 seconds, but that going to church, just using that as an example, not as a legalistic thing to like check the box off or anything like that, but making the effort to go to worship service on Sunday in 2025 takes a lot more. I'm not saying everybody's there for the right reasons, but there's not as much other stuff, worldly stuff to gain from being at church as there was, 100 years ago. But you're more there because you want to worship God. And I'm sure there were people 100 years ago that went to church just because they wanted to worship God and be in the Christian community, but
Well, I agree. I think today people are going to church more because they want to. They're looking for meaning,
right,
in their life.
For deeper reasons.
Yes, for deeper reasons. They're looking to find something meaningful in their lives, and I think that people are finding that there is a chasm in their life, and I believe that chasm that people are finding is one that God created in us to be filled by Him alone.
Unless you're Hophni and Phineas, Eli's sons, and you're just there to
Yes, indeed.
fill your stomachs and every desire.
Yes, indeed.
Well, we will, unless we have any other words from our associates here.
Short pause.
Co people. Yep. Short pause. We will be back in an instant.
As far as you know, in the recording.
We are in our second segment here and kind of wrapping things up, perhaps, but we'll see how things go. I have some applications, or we could go into that unless we have some more. We were talking about people needing people, or God kind of putting that into our makeup. How did we get to that? I'm trying to retrace. It's interesting when you step aside for 15 minutes and go out in the rain and you forget. What happened?
Connections. We were talking about people connecting with others and
going to church on Sunday.
Going to church on Sunday, yes. Thank you.
how structure of society.
Well, I am curious about this tabernacle period and the whole. So we go from tabernacle to temple, then to churches.
Yeah.
Temple and synagogue to churches.
Mm-hmm.
During the tabernacle period, there really wasn't any other. During the temple period, you had synagogues that were in like the local towns.
Mm-hmm.
and this can be because of the covenant period that we're in, that God relates to us in this way, you know, in a very personal way, and we're not centered on Jerusalem. You know, we're in like the church, we're in the new covenant, you know, so we don't have to make, I mean, we can go to Jerusalem and look at stuff if we want, but we don't, it's not like we need to go there for the Passover or something like that. You know,
no longer need to go there and offer sacrifices.
Yeah, as Jesus said to the Samaritan woman, you know, they'll not worship on this mountain or that mountain, but, you know, in spirit and truth.
That's right.
In this time, when they're meeting on the top of Shiloh, or I don't know if the mountain was called Shiloh, but the location Shiloh is on top of there's an interesting documentary where they look at that, and it's very kind of barren up there, I guess. You know, it's very kind of like a windswept top of I need to look at it again, but it's, you know, pretty views from up there, but, you know, it's, I don't know exactly how it looked like back then, but, you know, I did hear that they had to move the tabernacle around depending on the time of year because of, like, the direction of the wind. Because they would find piles of stuff, like the archaeologists, in different spots.
Well, that was interesting.
You know, bones and things. Not people bones, but like animal bones from like sacrifices and stuff. And the theory is they would move the tabernacle around, you know, because you don't want to be downwind of all that stuff. Because it stinks. Eventually it would,
It certainly would.
Yeah. But anyway, people would make this pilgrimage up there to this tent, and you know, I could see during the time of the temple because the temple was kind of a big structure and it had a big courtyard, and you know, it was in a city, and then you had synagogues kind of peppered around the countryside. You know, there was more of a community coming together, or something similar to churches. But I'm wondering how, just kind of trying to imagine how God related to the people in this time, you know, because you probably had your day out of the year that you went to Shiloh and made an offering, and you know, had to deal with Eli and his sons, and you know, maybe Samuel helped you out, I don't know, you know, but then you'd go back to your village. And did they have synagogues back then, or they had priests, right, that were in towns?
They had.
Was there any kind of gathering outside of going to this tent where the ark, you know, where the Ark of the Covenant was, and where the big kahuna priest was? But
I do not know if they had synagogues at this point in time.
How was it, I mean, even if it was word of mouth, how was it disseminated? You know, the stories.
How was the teaching?
Yeah, who
would teach the word of Adonai to the people of the tribes at
Would you go to the Levite's house? Was there like a Levite that lived in the village, and you'd go to their house and they'd talk to you?
I don't know.
Oh. Just something I've wondered about.
I will try to remember and find something out about that. That is something I have about which I've never thought.
And what was the population? I mean, because it was probably a few million people, right? That, at least in the time of Exodus, they were a couple million. I mean, who knows after the time of the judges, it might have been, population might have been down a little bit. But even if you have 1 million people spread around this area, it would seem like there'd be something else other than going to this, tabernacle.
Well, you think about it, and
well, Samuel, it does mention later on that Samuel kind of made a circuit, right? He went to, but
what is the population of Israel today?
In 2023, the population of Israel was 9,756,700.
Oh, well, now that's today, though.
Yeah. But then the population was probably not over 4 or 5 million people.
Yeah.
Which was still a lot.
But even a small country, I remember being in Iceland, and they only had I think they have a population of less than 1 million or around 1 million, like in the whole country, and it's an island, and it's probably about the same land area as Israel. But I can't imagine just having one spot where everybody would go.
Because it would take them too long to get there.
Yeah.
I mean, they would mostly travel on foot, so.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was at the top of a mountain. I don't know. So many questions, I guess.
Of course, the mountains there aren't like what we.
Oh yeah, they're not.
They're not that thousands and thousands of feet by no means.
Yeah.
So.
I think Mount Hermon is like pretty high, but that's one of the only few tall mountains over there. So most of them are like, the Smokies maybe.
Well, I was not prepared for how hilly Jerusalem is, and especially Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Bethlehem is, some of the streets go straight up. I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
It'd be great for sleigh riding.
Wow.
It was, I was not prepared for that. It surprised me completely.
Huh. Did you go to the birthplace thing? Oh. Down into the...
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you did? Oh, cool.
Had to wait a while, but we did.
Oh, how was that?
Well, it changes your life, and we got there at a good time. Our guide was very knowledgeable in the fact that he knew what time to get there, that the lines wouldn't be that terribly long, and they weren't.
Oh, that's good.
Sometimes you have to wait 5-6 hours to get in, but we didn't.
Wow.
We did not.
Hmm.
No, it's very moving.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
But yeah, I just wonder if it was something like that with the tabernacle, if there was like always a big line of people coming from all over to offer their...
Yeah, and you don't know how, we don't know how big it would have been, right? The tabernacle? Do we?
I think there's some rough numbers, but they don't really,
Okay.
like as far as like the grounds,
The size of the tabernacle is given in Leviticus.
Yeah. But as far as like the space you had to stand around outside of it, I don't know. wasn't like the temple that there was like an outer court and a inner court and a.
Yeah, I don't know that any of that is ever delineated for us.
Yeah.
And I looked up, it's just a quick note, it's nothing really in depth, but I asked it about how things were taught in the time of 1 Samuel. And, you know, like Samuel would go around and teach,
Yeah.
and then the leaders of each clan would be responsible for sharing the laws and the teachings of the family with their tribe
Oh, okay.
orally. So it was very much the responsibility of the family to share the teachings of the faith.
It would seem like that would take a lot of concentrated effort, you know, because you don't have buildings and, you know, scrolls and, you know, kind of, and I guess, you know, it just could be the culture with the word of mouth, and I've kind of wondered at the cohesiveness, and, you know, it could be God helping them to
There's
stay
no
cohesive,
TV.
you know, yeah. Well, that's true.
Everybody has to eat.
Yeah.
I would imagine they would get together and eat. They would be used to doing that to some extent communally. They would have oral traditions of sharing these folk tales, which would include all these stories that we have written in the Bible.
Yeah.
And they had the advantage of there being not nearly as many because they were a lot closer to the beginning of the book.
Well, that's true. That is true. They didn't have Kings and Chronicles and all that.
That's
all that
right.
Fun stuff.
They hadn't made it to Kings yet. So
I mean, so this is really, and I guess this is kind of a good segue into this. This is a very transitional time that we're looking at right now, because we're going from this time of Judges where everything's really loosely connected, and, you know, Judges was almost kind of like a, I don't want to say anarchy, but, you know, just like you had this person rise up God would raise up a judge,
mm-hmm.
and you would have kind of some stability, then everything would kind of fall apart. You know, so you had that sort of long, how long was the period of Judges? A couple hundred years? A few hundred years?
I think so.
Then you have this.
St. Matthew's.
Then you have this time with Samuel, and things really change under David. You know, well, I guess Saul and David, and then Solomon. You know, everything kind of becomes a lot more, you know, formalized, and Solomon builds the temple, and, you know, So do you see much, I guess it's kind of a long way of saying, do you see much, as we're drawing applications out of what's happening here in Samuel and this time to what is going on today? Because I know we've seen some, there have been a lot of comparisons to what's happening today to like the times of the Roman Empire and, the way kind of Christianity flourishing in a pagan society and all that. And, but I don't know. I feel like we kind of are I'm staying out of politics. I'm kind of going
In a
around
transitional period.
Yeah, that there's a lot of stuff happening, and we're kind of, and it could be that we're just going into the end times. Or, we probably are always headed towards the end times.
Well, there are some people who believe we've been in the end times for the last 2,000 years.
Yeah, so there you go.
Yes, I would like to believe that we are in a transitional period. If we look at things historically, there have been revivals every century or so in the church. I think we are seeing one now.
Yeah. It does seem like it.
We are seeing, the churches that we are seeing grow at this point are the churches that have chosen to not give in and make the desires and whims of society bow down to the religion.
Yeah.
They have clung more to the scriptures.
Yeah.
We have.
Well, I guess like the Asbury thing. I call it the Asbury thing.
The revival.
The revival.
Yeah.
You see stuff like that kind of popping up.
Yeah.
And it's kind of coming from younger people. Not that I'm not saying you're old, but not that people your generation aren't doing anything. There's certainly people from every generation that do great things for God, but it seems like there's a sort of this.
My mother kind of raised me to be a Campbellite. No creed but Christ, and no authority but the Scripture.
Oh, okay.
And I feel that way today, much the way I was raised.
Campbellite, is that?
Yeah. What was the first name? Josh Campbell.
John Campbell?
He established the Disciples of Christ, I think.
Oh,
I think
that
he'd
guy.
be
Oh, yeah, I didn't
his,
know his name was Campbell.
I think he'd spinning his graves now, seeing what's happened to the Disciples of Christ Church. But
when you said Campbell, I think of soup.
I think it's soup.
And I think of there's a clan in Scotland named Campbell.
But I think God has given us the Bible.
Yeah.
As a tool to help us understand Him, to lay the groundwork to help us approach Him, and that gives us the framework for us to pray and stimulate a desire in ourselves to want to know God and be open to a relationship with Him. And if we are sincerely open to a relationship with God, we will have one. And I fear that a lot of churches don't encourage people to do that.
Well, it is interesting how, and it seems to be more a phenomena with Christianity that, you know, we're given this freedom. You know, God doesn't. I guess I should back up.
Okay.
I mean, you did see this some in the Middle Ages where Christians would burn somebody at the stake for heresy or something like that, you know,
Mm-hmm.
for some of them weren't heretics, but some of them were, you know, but it kind of depends, but you have such, and it seems like the spread keeps getting more and more, and this could be something more in the West, that you have, like, there's a church around the corner here, and I won't specify that. It's one of those where it's like, you know, believe whatever you want to believe, and, you know, it's, you know, whatever, we're just coming together, and it's not really anything, you know what I mean? It's but then you have, like you said, more denominations that try to stick to the scriptures more, and then you have, you know, then you have your Catholics that try to stick to the scriptures, but also have more traditions and things, but that have been a little more stable. And it seems, you know, God's not sending lightning bolts down to catch on fire the churches that don't, you know, that are preaching like a gospel that's contrary to what Scripture teaches.
Well, God is giving us freedom.
But it does seem like the ones that are going like really astray are the ones that are kind of dying out more. You know, because you kind of get to a point where like, well, what's really the difference between, why are we even here? You know, it's like,
The ones that are shaping themselves more to society's norms are dying because there is no difference between them and society. It's not upheld by God, and they are falling apart.
yeah.
But here in
But Jesus said, love everybody.
Yeah.
Jesus does say love everybody,
Yeah.
but
I mean,
Jesus also says everyone's not going to make it into heaven.
That's right.
but I guess the example I was using was like, there's a Unitarian church near here, and they kind of,
Well,
some Unitarians believe that Jesus is God, some don't. You know, it's kind of just like,
well,
and I'll admit, I've never attended a service at a Unitarian congregations.
I am
I'm
guilty
just
of
going
never-
off of what people tell me.
I am guilty of never
Unitarians I've
having
known.
done that either.
But
Um,
I could go to their website and see what they say, but but I mean, they're.
I am sure that many Unitarians are very nice people,
Oh, for sure.
but part of me is I wasn't raised that way. My personal theology doesn't embrace that. I believe that there is one way to get into heaven, and that is through Jesus, God's Messiah. And I know him to be the only access to eternity with God.
Well, I guess kind of one thing I was getting at was that God allows, it's almost like you kind of see the subtle hand of God over the centuries allowing truth or to be maintained while at the same time giving us freedom and giving, I mean, of course, again, there are exceptions of, like the Middle Ages where people were chasing Protestants and Catholics were chasing each other around with pitchforks and stuff. And, but even in the midst of that, and I guess you could look at the people of Israel in the Bible. There were groups of them that went off and worshiped Baal and did all this other stuff, and but somehow or another, the Old Testament, the scriptures survived, and we have them, and sometimes there was a faithful few that made it through, but like the time of exile and
But we, at this point, here in 1 Samuel, the word of God was being given directly to individuals.
yeah.
Now, we have the advantage of having been given to us records of many instances of God having had direct interchanges with many people to display his love and forgiveness and his discipline, as well as the structure that he desires us to maintain. Now, maintaining that structure was a real problem for Eli. It caused his death and the death of his sons.
Well, and I would imagine the actions of his sons kind of put the people in a position where some of them were wondering, why am I wasting the time to come up here and offer this, offering to God when his sons are taking it, and, why is God allowing this?
Do you think they knew?
Oh, the people or his sons?
No, do you think the people knew that their offerings were being hijacked?
Oh.
Well, I think so.
I think on one instance it does mention something like they say, "Give us the meat."
Show me the beef.
Will you show me the beef?
So why doesn't, so I'm just being devil's advocate. So if they knew that the sons were stealing their sacrifices, I wonder why the mob didn't take matters
Yeah.
into their own hands, since clearly the king wasn't going to, since Eli wasn't going to do anything about it. I just wondering why they didn't
Yeah, that's kind of.
off them themselves.
Well, I think that's why things happened as it did. Samuel was being raised as a prophet
Mm-hmm.
at this time, and he was being led and instructed by the voice of God.
Mm-hmm.
And what Eli's sons were doing was slowly becoming known to the people, and Eli wasn't doing anything about it. And I agree that people were coming to the point where they were thinking, well, why in the world are we doing this?
Yeah.
Because Eli's sons are ignoring it, and we get to see here later in Samuel, here very soon, that God steps up and does something about it.
Well, it says that they would come. They would send. Let's see. The custom was the priest was that the people that, whenever any man offered a sacrifice, the priest servant would come and thrust a fork in, and whatever would come out of like a boiling pot, they would take as their portion. But they would come up to the people, I guess, before they offered the sacrifice, and they'd say, give us the fat and the filet mignon, or
give us the good stuff.
The good stuff, yeah. And then I thought they were sleeping with the women around the tabernacle, but I don't know if that was something
I don't recall it saying that, but I would not be surprised.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Oh, it says, I thought they did. Fattening yourselves with my offerings. Well, yeah, I don't know. I thought I read that somewhere, but
anyway,
fattening themselves with the offering was bad enough, I guess.
before it got completely out of hand with the people, God yanked them up short and killed them.
Yeah, there you go.
And
Yeah.
God killed Eli, and Samuel was old enough and trained enough to take his proper place as the voice of God in Israel.
Well,
So
it is
God took
interesting,
these years to prepare Samuel to be his voice over the nation.
Yeah.
And he killed Eli and his family.
Yeah. Well, I do find it interesting just how God, throughout time, and I mean in these times and in our times, allows us to choose, to follow him or not, and gives us free choice and all that, but at the same time provides, well, in this case the course correction was he just killed Eli and his sons, or has them just taken off the chessboard, you know, but sometimes it's, you know, God working through and blessing certain endeavors, and, you know, it's
God has a
interesting.
plan.
Yeah, God has a plan and works through our
And works
messiness.
through us, and if we don't do our part, God makes sure his plan is still going to work.
Yeah.
And if we don't do our part, somebody else is going to do what we needed to do.
A Samuel.
That's right.
So, getting to the kind of the applications I see here, you know, we do see the theme that God desires interaction with us, and, you know, the word of the Lord was rare, but it didn't necessarily have to be that way. It was just that way because of what especially Eli and his sons were doing. But we see God's persistence in calling Samuel in this instance, and then we see that he revealed himself again to Samuel at Shiloh, and we're not told exactly what happened there, but we're just told that this was an ongoing, you know, God was continually communicating with Samuel.
I think that's important. You know, they're the
it's kind of thrown in there, but it's, you know,
the last two verses there in chapter 3. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba became aware that Shmuel had been confirmed as a prophet of Adonai. Adonai continued appearing in Shiloh, for Adonai revealed himself to Shmuel in Shiloh by the word of Adonai. God continued to talk to Adonai, to Samuel,
Shmuel.
and the people knew it.
Yeah, they figured out he had the ear of God, that's for sure.
And they listened to Samuel.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine that things went better with Samuel than they ever had under Eli.
Yeah.
Because they were being taught. They were being taught the Word of God and instructed properly. And again, we have an amazing advantage. We have the entire book.
Yeah. We don't have to hunt down the priest.
We don't have to go to Shiloh.
Hey, what's the word?
We don't have to go to Shiloh and find when Samuel's talking.
Yeah.
But it makes demands on us because of our freedom.
Yeah.
Do we take the time to read God's Word? Do we take the time to pray? Do we approach God with the sincerity of, real heartfelt desire to know Him and love Him? Because that's a requirement.
Yeah.
And if we do that, God will respond to us. And that's a very wonderful thing.
It is. So that was kind of my concluding thing. How do we respond? But you kind of.
I didn't mean to
Wrapped it
steal
up.
your thunder. Why would you say that?
No, I was gonna, right before that, I was gonna mention, and we could end with this, but that was kind of the big question, I think, here. How do we respond when God is calling us? And it's interesting to look at the course of events, particularly in the narratives of the Old Testament, and just kind of how God works through different people and circumstances and can plant a seed, and that 100 years later something happens because that. With Hannah, going back at the beginning of Samuel, it's you have Hannah not able to conceive, and this brings about her praying to conceive and offering that her first child would be. Well, she doesn't know that she's going to have more kids after Samuel, but she, like, if you just give me a kid, I'll just give him over to service of the Lord, and it's interesting that was part of God's plan, because that's how you got this boy that was raised essentially in the temple to be the successor, because it's almost like God knew that Eli's sons either were in the process of not being able to do that, or they weren't going to be able to do that.
He became the first of the line of prophets of Israel.
Yeah. I
think back upon the mothers of some of the children in Israel, and at least the ones that we're made aware of, many of them were women who had not been able to have children. You have to remember what a big deal it was for women at the time. Pardon. It was really important that you have children. I mean, if you didn't have children, you were kind of ostracized from the local sewing circles and everything.
Watering holes.
Right. You just weren't anybody in the group of females in the community if you didn't have children. And many of the greatest of the people that we have seen, their mothers were barren.
Yeah.
And God blessed them with children in their older years.
Yeah.
And raised their children to be tremendous in the eyes of God.
Yeah.
And it should give people, pause to think that. I mean, the big thing about these women was they didn't give up hope. Look at Hannah. Look at Mary's cousin Elizabeth.
Yeah.
They just prayed.
Yeah.
Prayed to have children.
Well, I think that's another good theme here, don't give up hope, because it does seem like Eli and his sons, and especially his sons' wives, when they're giving birth, and they die giving birth or something when they hear that their husbands were killed and the ark was taken. You have a lot of people kind of giving up hope, and then you have, Samuel taking the reins, and it's kind of encouraging. You have this really dark time, but God's still giving the people hope. And I mean, you still have that choice. Am I gonna give up, and give up hope because the ark's been taken, and but then it wasn't about the object. It was God was still with them. It was the ark, was a symbol, but it wasn't. Anyway.
The something that the Jews have continued to hold, they are still God's chosen people. As ornery and stiff-necked as they are still God's chosen people. And
well, that's a can of worms, Bill.
And we are told, we can find it in the scripture, that there always will be a remnant faithful to God in his people. And we just have to remember that. As we study the scripture, are we going to be one of the faithful remnant in our time?
Yeah.
There are times it just, am I trying to be that enough?
Yeah. And I would dive into, well, just for the sake of time, we'll leave that there. I think, yes.
Some days I'm certainly more successful than others.
No, you did. That was good. Well, unless there are any other words or thunderous pronouncements, we shall continue next week. And off the top of my head, I'm thinking, well, you do have the instance with David and the threshing floor. I don't know if that's a theophany, though. I think that's just an angel that, when David does the census, and well, that could fit in with our theme. I'll have to look and see what the next occurrence is.
The next real theophany,
yeah. Because we've looked at instances where it's said that God was angry or something, or
yeah.
And God was certainly not pleased with David doing the census.
No.
So anyway, we will get back with you on that, but there's certainly a lot more to look at because we're just in 1 Samuel. This is a pretty good series so far. So thank you for listening, making it this far, and we wish you a good week and a prosperous week. You're supposed to do your,
Oh.
yeah. Can you make the hand signal? There you go.